Hi again, everybody. Scott Costa, the publisher of TED Magazine. Thanks for joining me for another Distributed with TED Magazine podcast. Got a special one for you again from NAED and Ed Orlet as we get into the Futures Group. They're going to be hosting another office hours event. I got to tell you, I was at the NAED Eastern Region Conference. The Futures Group held an event there in a packed room of passionate distributors and manufacturers who had vibrant conversations about the future of our supply chain. We have another one coming up for you, our office hours, December the 8th. At 1 p.m. Central, they're going to be talking about electric vehicles, the potential and the roadblocks and everything that you need to know about them. It's going to be a great conversation. To know more about it, to learn more about the Futures Group, you can go to naed.org/futures to register and make sure that you're there on December the 8th. In the meantime, Ed Orlet and Mark Dancer put together this video, this podcast that you can watch or you can listen to so you learn more about the electric vehicle potential. Here it is. A preview of the office hours with Ed Orlet and Mark Dancer.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to NAED's office hours with Ed and Mark. We are here today to talk about electric vehicles, the charging infrastructure, the incentives that are being floated around, the mandates that different states and federal governments and targets that they're setting. Certainly does seem to be a huge opportunity for our industry over the coming years. There are certainly some hurdles that we got to get over, so we're going to look at both sides of this thing. And who better to join me into this great journey into the future than the Network for Business Innovation's principal chief brain, galaxy brain guru, Mark Dancer. Mark, good to see you as always.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here, Ed. I think there's a lot of opportunity. We think about electric vehicles and electrification to think about those big ideas that we're not thinking about. And then what do we actually do today to start moving in the right direction?
Absolutely. Literally hundreds of billions of dollars will be spent over the next 10 years at different levels of government and in private industry on building out this infrastructure. The opportunity is huge. The federal government has said they want to have, they have a goal of net zero emissions in the economy by 2050. We'll see how that goes. There's some states like California and Virginia that are making goals to have a completely electric vehicle fleet in their states by 2030, 2035. I mean, those are not long horizons. So there's going to be a lot of money spent here. The federal government has got billions and billions of dollars set aside to develop these charging corridors. So a ton of opportunity for our industry. So Mark and I are going to talk about that, getting you ready for our office hours where we're going to have a couple of industry experts help us out with the details of how that build out's going to look. But also we want to also draw on an interview I did with Peter Zihan, who is was a great keynote speaker at an NAED regional last year. And also a guy who has some really interesting thoughts on the complexity of moving towards a carbon neutral economy and how it's not as simple as we might all think it is. So what I really like about this discussion is we're going to have, look at this issue from a variety of angles, and I think give you a really well-rounded perspective. So with that, let's get into things. All right, Mark, so specific to electric cars, the opportunity that's in front of our industry over the next 20 years is certainly something we can't afford to ignore. What it looks like, how this stuff gets sold, I think those are some of the questions that we're going to have to wrestle with and figure out what our role is in the channel and how this stuff gets sold, because a lot of it is public, a lot of them are big projects. But even at that point, even you think about the home also, not only with chargers, but in the last the Inflation Reduction Act that the Congress passed recently, there's funding for electrical upgrades, electrical service upgrades to accommodate changing from gas appliances to electric appliances. There's obviously incentives for charging, for home charging as well. So there's a lot of money being spent. if you look at the growth rate, we had a couple of years of pretty aggressive growth. Not only, the pent up demand from COVID, but also price inflation. Has really done a number on our growth in a good way. But if you look, even though you could say, well, we had real huge growth spikes in the electric car space in the last few years, and now it looks, if you look at the numbers here, it looks to be leveling off. But look at where it's leveling off. The revenue growth is still in 20% range for the foreseeable future. So there's a lot of money going into this space. The Edison Electric Institute also has some data points on this. And we're talking about, look, we're going to need to install around 13 million charge ports to support the electric vehicles that'll be on U.S. roads within a decade. That's all happening now, right? There's a lot of material to be sold in the near future and currently, and there's a lot of incentives around it. So the money's there, the money's being spent on electric vehicles. The market is being made now. And I think when I think about this stuff, the most recent experience I have with something similar was when we were talking about solar panels, 10, 15 years ago. And that market opportunity that was experiencing some pretty fundamental or impressive growth. There was a question about who was going to do that work, right? Is it the roofer? Is it a solar panel contractor? In any case, to get that thing connected, you still had to have an electrician, but it wasn't sure how that stuff was going to be supplied. Electric cars are much more in our wheelhouse. The charging infrastructure is much more in our wheelhouse. The installation of home chargers, much more in our wheelhouse. But then when we think about the fast chargers and sort of the public works grade projects, it's not as clear to me as how that stuff gets supplied. But there's certainly going to be opportunities for distributors for the foreseeable future. It's interesting, when I talked to Peter Zeihan about this, the limitations that he thinks are going to keep us from efficiently or too easily getting to the kind of scale you're talking about in an electric fleet. And I want to take a look at that part of the conversation and get your response to it. So let's take a look at Peter's discussion of what he sees as the limitations.
Well, I'd say three things. First of all, the amount of material that is required to do what we say we want to do does not exist on this planet. If you want to, for example, have 4 hours of electricity storage so that you can store sun and wind basically for when you actually need it, there is barely enough lithium on the planet to do that in the United States, 4 hours. But if your goal is zero carbon, you don't need 4 hours, you need 4 months, because you have to store summer sun for the winter, because peak demand in most places is after sundown in the middle of winter. So we don't even have the material, assuming everything runs perfectly. Second, processing. Most of the processing for this is low tech, but on the polluting side, and most of it is done in China, and most of it is coal-fired. So there's a split problem there. Number one, the input cycle in order to get us the stuff we need for solar and for wind and for lithium is one of the most polluting industries out there. And applying those technologies in places that are not particularly sunny or windy, which is where most of humanity lives, is actually a net put of carbon into the atmosphere rather than a net gain out. Also, you have to relocate all the processing away from places that are either filthy or untrustworthy or engage in things like slave labor or coal-fired power systems that we don't really approve of. And that's China. So about 80% of this needs to move anyway. That's a 2-year process, assuming nothing else goes wrong. And then third, there's the materials in the first place. And let me share a graphic with you here. This is one of the graphics from the book about inputs into the various technologies that we're using. If you start for the top of both of these, you're going with the green tech, and as you go to the bottom, you're getting to more conventional. And you can see that the upfront materials inputs into these things are just hugely different. I mean, even assuming no intermittency issue, even assuming the sun never goes down, the materials that you need to run green tech with today's technology are roughly an order of magnitude more complicated. I mean, we understand oil supply chains. We don't like them, but we understand them. You have to deal with Venezuela and Iraq and Russia. But if you want to do green tech, you need Canada and Mexico and Bolivia and Argentina and Chile and Brazil and Australia and Vietnam and Laos and Pakistan and Iran, China, and of course still Russia. So we haven't processed yet in the industry or in our ideology about what it really means if we want to do this at scale. And we're now coming up against some very real barriers that we can't just push through.
You know, I think one of the ways to think about this for distributors, which is very natural for electrical distributors, is through reshoring, right? Mm-hmm. So electrical distributors buy globally and stock locally. And in Peter's message, there's some really good news for distributors, because as globalization unwinds and there's reshoring, he said it, there's going to be a lot more local inventory carried, right? It's going to come less from afar, and there's going to be safety stocks here. That's great for distributors, but you know, that's not a supply chain of the future solution. That's a supply chain pre-globalization solution. We'll just carry more inventory. And yes, that will financially benefit us, right? But I think it's incumbent for distributors to stop and say, what does the supply chain look like when reshoring happens? Right? Because we know what that should look like. And it's things like, as reshoring builds, how do we do transparency differently? How do we do data sharing differently? How do we do sharing of inventory across distributors, across line of trade differently? How do we contribute to, you know, our customers managing their risk and optimizing the business within the frame of reshoring for the future, not reshoring just a bulk hard solution of adding inventory locally?
Yeah, great vision, and in a good way to sort of put the wraps on this thing. Boy, we really went out there today, which is the point of the Futures Group, folks. Is we're thinking long term, and so Mark, great work today. Great thinking about the future and about how we can do things better over the long run. So everybody, remember to join us on December 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can register at www.naed.org/futures. We've got a couple of guests that we're efforting right now, but we hope to have a couple of real industry experts, not only in the production of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but also on the public policy side. So stay tuned for more information on that. Stay tuned for Mark's article. Get a look at that. To set this thing up. As always, thanks for watching and thanks for supporting NAED.